heart and soul of why reading is important. It teaches us about the human condition. It teaches us about forgiveness. It teaches us about violence and human relationships. I think this is incredibly important that people learn this in a standardized setting where the very best books are selected and disseminated to the general public. First, I'm modeling the two arguments. One, on why we think the establishment of a canon is in and of itself important in education, and secondly, why we think this results in inclusive diversity. One, on the model. We think that literature means primarily fiction that marks discussions of human nature. Things Shakespeare, Dickens, Twain. We think this largely excludes things like mass market fiction like Colleen Hoover and nonfiction. We think those are outside of the debate. Secondly, how do we think the development of a new inclusive literary canon is likely to look like? I think this is probably going to be a top-down discussion from academia, which established the canon in the first place, and trickle down. So we think that likely this is going to be a discussion between professors and academics, as well as the writing industry, organizations that establish publishing awards, critics, things like that. I think that's likely to trickle down into curricula and what the literary canon as established in high school curriculums is across the world. We think this is probably going to look like different experts and interest groups being consulted, as in the development of all curricula. That is most likely what an inclusive literary canon is going to look like. I'll discuss what we think the comparative looks like a little later in my speech. Firstly then, on the importance of a canon. Why do I think we need a canon in the first place? It is important to recognize that very few people read. The only interaction the vast majority of people have in their lives with historical fiction, especially complex fiction, is going to be within the classroom. And even if people are going on their own time to read books, they're probably just Googling most important books, or like most relevant books I need to read, and going off what is established from the Google search results. So I think that the canon is incredibly important because it makes up an extremely sizable amount of the literature that people are going to interact with throughout the majority of their lives. So, why do we think that when you establish a canon, you have a good repertoire of books? One, we think there is extensive academic research into their merits, that the ones that are likely to rise to the top are those that are most universally agreed upon to be important and be important to engaging in critical discussion. We actually think that the books that are likely to rise to the top of the literary canon are those that rise the most discussion amongst academics, the ones that offer the most unique perspectives, the ones that offer the deepest analysis of themes, and the ones that are repeated most often when academics discuss them are the books that are likely to establish and become the ones that are most known. But secondly, we think there's also a very important level of standardization, that when these books are considered the literary canon, all the efforts of curriculum building, all the efforts of breaking down these books into easy to understand discussion questions is done on a national level, that national curriculums and huge amounts of resources are applied into making these books as easy to understand as possible and easy to teach as possible. I think this is incredibly important because it means that this canon becomes very well established and very easy to explain. I'll take closing.
To be very clear, OG's burden is not to say there'll be discussion within academics and then you'll have diversity. There don't exist that many inclusive Shakespeare-like books, so you need to prop artists from the ground up.
Okay, no, because a literary canon is established by experts. That is how the canon in the status quo is established. Naturally, that's how a new canon would also be established. I don't think this is going to happen like on TikTok. Okay. That being said, why do you think this is established well? One, there's obviously huge pressure for the public to have an actually inclusive literary canon. We've seen huge movements like Oscars So White that pressure media to be more representative of the people. We also think that particularly in literature, that in many university departments, there's been a strong leftist lean. That's why we've seen the rise of, for example, things like post-colonial literature or critical race theory become so important in academia, is because there's also significant pressure to include greater representation. So we think this is probably going to be a good thing. There are two important impacts of this. One, we think that classics are very important, that yes, they are difficult to understand, but they teach us important things about human forgiveness. When you read about Shakespeare, for example, you're reading about humans and how they can forgive each other and how when they create critical mistakes, they can tear entire families apart. We think these are universal lessons that are incredibly important for people to learn, and we think this is a level of engagement that they otherwise would not be able to have with this work. We think that just because a work is old, just because the language is complicated, doesn't mean that it doesn't have incredibly important universal values. We think on our side of the house we're able to retain that. But secondly, on diversity. We think that when you are going to have a new, more inclusive literary canon, it's probably going to be the works that are the most problematic. The Lockharts or the other authors of the world who are considered racist or bigoted, that probably is the worst works that are going to be excluded and are going to be left out of the canon that have received the most backlash. We think that good, productive works that are in the literary canon and should remain in the literary canon, like To Kill a Mockingbird, that do teach us important lessons about racism, are likely to be the ones that remain. But what is the counterfactual? On their side of the house, they have to defend a world where there is no canon. There is no established media for what people should learn and what people should read. And so what people are exposed to is probably two things. One, what their teachers' personal biases are, where there's no unified national curriculum, where there isn't widespread academic and internet resources for how to teach this work and how to best distill it down, when there isn't established discussion of how to learn these themes, or just social media, where people randomly are fed to them by their algorithms or by their biases of what they see online. I think that there's no unified idea for understanding complex ideas. Okay, second argument then on increased diversity. We think that when on our side, you're more likely to have careful selection and debate for which of these groups should be within the literary canon. On their side, we think that you are susceptible to two kinds of biases. One, obviously individual biases. If your teacher is racist, if your teacher is homophobic, the things that they perceive to be part of the literary canon are obviously going to trickle down in incredibly harmful ways to the works that are selected on your side of the house. But secondly, there's obviously going to be huge interest groups that are going to try to push a new literary canon based off of things like industrial interests or business interests or what they think that people should be learning in their groups. So I think that they're open to a huge amount of bias on their side of the house when you have a lot of different groups rather than trying to make one unified canon that faces immense academic pressure and immense social pressure for what it should look like. We think that there's going to be probably regional groups where, for example, in Florida, the discussion of what becomes a normal literary canon becomes very different and toxic and much worse than other parts of the country, whereas we think under a standardized system it's much better. I'll take another POI from closing.
It's not like we don't have any curriculum on our side. Obviously the curriculum looks different. It's not like all the biases just
obviously you have a curriculum, but there is no standardization. There's no accepted idea of what should be in those. So obviously local school boards that have their much stronger biases have way bigger freedom to defer away from academic ideals on their own time. Why do we think that this is important? One, not only do we think it's important to teach the canon so that people can understand critical thinking. That's why we teach complicated historical texts so people can derive things like themes and ideas from books that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. But it also gives us a unified understanding of the oppression that groups face when you are able to have inclusive text. When you have to read Elie Wiesel's Night, when you have to read The Hate U Give and understand how police brutality looks like in America for black people. We think that gives people a common touch point across the country or even across the world for what oppression looks like. It's important that people read the same books so that people are able to be on the same page and understand who the oppressors are, who are the oppressed. And we think that what that means is that people often become more empathetic. Because the process of literature is that you grow to relate to the protagonists, you understand their actions, you understand the oppression they face, and you feel the unjustness of the circumstances that they're in. We think that an inclusive literary canon does much more to defy racist stereotypes and expectations than the lack of one. For this reason, I'm very proud to propose.
Thanks, Peter, for that fine speech. I now invite the leader of opposition.
At its core, this is a characterization clash debate. It's about one where the publishers, who are probably going to be the counterfactual and decide what popularity looks like, the TikToks that you see have better incentives or interest than the old stuffy academia that opening government want to talk about. That is going to be the first argument I make. Since Gov correctly and identifies that it's probably going to be academia and people who have long scholarly expertise deciding what that work looks like, I think they're much, much worse incentives than Gov would want to do. Notice the language here. It is deep, it is going to be nuanced, it is going to be specific. This, in many instances, actually means far more unrelatable. And that's because the notion of it being deep and standardized must necessarily mean it has to A, be older in nature, i.e. talk about language that often is happening over historical times, because often to establish a canon and to agree it is canon takes decades in many instances with a lot of consensus formed around it. But secondly, in many instances, the average academic obviously wants to prioritize what meets their objective standards rather than what is always easiest to teach it. Quite obviously, because if you spend decades studying academia, the principles you build up over what good literature ought to be is more important than whether some school in some area is going to value your specific art in the first place. I think even if opening government's values are important to talk about, the form in which those values are given out is far more important. Because obviously people do not understand the language that they are being exposed to in a classroom if the work that is being taught to them by a teacher who's often underfunded in a poor neighborhood, most middle-level neighborhoods, or it is being taught in a boring way, is language they do not understand or they do not relate to, until the point where they have to mug it up, like in most Indian and Pakistani schools that we can talk about, and just regurgitate that out within your specific classroom. You do not appreciate the values that you're being taught. You just try and do it maybe for a better classroom in the first place. Let's then be very clear what exactly the counterfactual is. look, maybe on either side of the house, the people that we're talking about are white, right? Maybe it's going to be academia on their side, probably publishers on our side and TikTok. But obviously publishers have far better interests, because what's most important to them is what makes the most money, i.e. what has the highest amount of demand in today's society. So this means they're likely to do things like ensure that the work that they put out is going to be based on what is the most highest selling in the first place. It's going to be based on what exactly the people that provide that art to them, like minority, like which niche that they are catering to a unique extent or unique value, that is going to be the art that they cater to and see a lot more. So the implication is that obviously the kind of art that you get exposed to is first decided by people on the ground, and that's the kind of art that's regurgitated out to further audiences, as compared to their side of the house, which obviously the art is decided by people from the top. And crucially, since opening government concedes that already we are having liberalizing norms in today's world, and probably there's a lot more inclusivity around racial minorities because of the increasing standards around, like, for example, you being exposed to other, like, wider variety of viewpoints on social media, because you're seeing it within the schools that you go to and the cities you're engaging in. That obviously happens a lot more on our side of the house. OG, go ahead.
If you look at the New York Times bestsellers list, do you think that Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Colleen Hoover is what should be taught to schools because it's most easily digestible and enjoyable for students?
Yes. Okay. Given this time, what exactly then is going to happen on our side of the house, right? The newspapers we are then going to be talking about, right? The newspapers. So the second argument I want to make though is, I think we just have far less shamed when you're trying to indulge or move away from the divergent viewpoint. Obviously, on either side of the house, many people will not agree or value the established canon. People on the ground do not relate to or understand it, or who find it particularly complicated. Obviously, the problem that then happens inside government is when you have a viewpoint of not liking that specific canon, you are often shamed a lot more on our side of the house, precisely because individuals will say, this is something that many experts who are supposedly smarter and better than you and have higher education than you have said this is important. How dare you, in many instances, disagree over what that specific action looks like? Notice on the counterfactual. Sure, some people may not like what is most popular, but there are two differentiating factors that determine this. One, the very act of you deciding art based on popularity suggests a larger percentage of people are not going to be shamed on our side of the house, because the art that they choose is likely to be in line with what the majority is in many instances. And since we probably all agree in many instances of liberalizing art that often is willing to be anti-colonial in nature in most developing nations, there is good art in many instances. But secondly, even if people diverge from popularity, it is popularity that's dictated by current trends of the last few years. So it means the amount of shame you experience is far, far less than on curve, where it's often canon established over the last 50 years that you have to fight back against. What does this mean? This means when it's decided inside government, you often see a paper that's not able to talk about an art that you specifically like, or you hear a professor in your classroom talk about art that is not specifically great. That's what makes you feel a lot worse. That makes you feel a lot less represented. That makes you feel a lot less empowered on your side of the house. Given this, then this makes you feel, I think this is just much, much worse. Before we move on to this, CG,
In your world, literature in schools is still pushed by academics, so incentives of the academics remain the same.
Well, the first problem is, congratulations on knifing opening government. Secondly, you have to beat my structured analysis why this is not true. Good luck. Okay, given this, what does this then mean? On their side of the house, there is a lot more shame for being divergent from what the canon is, as compared to on our side of the house, like by the popular newspapers and that sort of stuff, as compared to on our side of the house, where probably the newspapers decide what is good or important to you in a more organic way on what people on the ground happen to be liking. Thirdly though, I think this also just means we get far more modern literature as compared to Psych-Up. And this is, to be clear, different from claim number one, which is just about how, like, on their side of the house, the art can be whitewashed in many instances, right? Look, probably we'll all agree that classic art often means what is much, much older, right? And that means a few different things. In the absence of this, there is normally incentives to want to provide art that's more inclusive, because the teacher obviously chooses art that's more relatable to their own to their own feelings, but also because obviously you have regional curriculums in our side of the house, so art is still standardized, but the regional curriculum is decided by people who, for example, look at what might be art that is more valuable to people on the ground, as opposed to feeling they must always establish 5 or 6 books that must be part of the literary canon, otherwise their regional curriculum group will not get funding from the national government on their side of the house. The implication then is the following. On our side of the house, the art is obviously going to be far more inclusive in a few different ways, and there are 3 ways I want to impact this. Firstly, it's going to be a lot more relatable to people on the ground. Notice what this looks like. This looks like things like Pakistani literature often being far more important on the international stage, or becoming more popular and taught in schools across the world, or at least comparatively, art from different backgrounds is going to be more important to them, as opposed to their side of the house where the minorities they choose to talk about are either going to be rich, stuffy, whitewashed works of art in many instances, because that is what the academics have determined is relatable or valuable, or like having nuanced writing according to their own standards. And obviously, it's often going to be far more practical to people's lives. So it will be something like, it's maybe written in simpler language, in simpler prose, because that's what people appreciate, as compared to art that maybe is written in a highly sophisticated and nuanced way that often people don't understand. But secondly, this is obviously what links into talking about current issues to far greater extent today, because the art we get to have propagated across our society is far more like today's world, right? So you're able to talk about issues and the nuances and the way racism happened today, as opposed to what happened with slavery 50 or 60 years ago, which is obviously what creates a really harmful impact outside government. But you often think that so long as the racism is not as bad as that of yesteryears, you do not need to talk or challenge about it to the same extent today. And especially when you're taught about this from a school, from a young age, and it's indoctrinated into you, it's a massive impact, because on our side of the house, the art that is chosen is the art that still says today's problems are important and worth talking about and fighting against, as opposed to their side where so long as it's not as intense as before, it is much, much worse. For all these reasons, very happy to report.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. I now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Can someone nice enough to offer a piece of paper? Thank you.
So much of the LO was uncomparative to what an inclusive canon actually looks like. This is not being decided in cigar smoke-filled old rooms. This is being decided by English departments of today, which are often heavily diverse. Sometimes, arguably, the criticism made by conservatives is that they're too diverse, that they're full of African American studies academics in the United States, that they're increasingly focused on postmodern academic critiques and increasingly modern and diverse selection. But second of all, their burden was to prove that people's teachers and their local selection was more diverse and more suited to what individual people wanted than academia. And that was always going to fall victim to the fact that they are defending majoritarianism. Their selection mechanism of publishers and what is popular is always going to mean that there's an incentive to produce and promote books which appeal to the largest majority of people in a given society, who just numerically are going to be the majority. Yes, there are incentives to appeal to particular niches, but that is always going to be a far statistically smaller number of people than are the way that the inclusive canon functions. And so I think the biggest gap in opening opposition is that they don't decide how do we view something as not just being popular and something you should read, but something good, something that teaches moral messages that you should actually internalize. And I don't think the fact that the language is complex or difficult to understand is a reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a reason why these books need to be taught in useful ways. There are actual skills that come with digesting Shakespeare and digesting the vast majority of 19th or 20th century literature, which is written in hard to understand but possible to understand language. And there are three unique benefits. One, the messages in them are deep, profound, and not on the surface level. There's an academic benefit of critically thinking and debating what the meaning is and what the various interpretations are. Critically, those are not set top-down. Academics decide which books are valuable, but they don't decide on one set interpretation. To Kill a Mockingbird has many different schools of thought. The Grapes of Wrath has many different schools of thought about what that book means and what we should read into it. Second, the act of debating about certain common cultural touchstones creates a high culture that is very inclusive. One of the issues that many societies have is that they do not have forms of high culture that are inclusive. Rather, that high culture is racial. It depends on wealth. It depends on a variety of factors. But an understanding of high culture as defined by literature is something that every single student can understand because they all take that English class, they all read the Grapes of Wrath, they all read Shakespeare, and they arrive at university equipped with the skills and language to understand that and be able to talk about it even if they are not white and even if they are not originally part of high culture. And third of all, these are often very deep and profound. Authors like Toni Morrison with Black Women, authors like Octavia Butler, authors like E.M. Forster like Gay in Olden Times, these were in the 20th century. They're not crazy modern inventions. They've had time to diffuse and be criticized and be understood as part of the inclusive literary canon. And so, the first question I want to address then is why should we not get rid of the old? The thing that LO is not engaging with in their absolutist defense of relatability is just how little the old canon will actually get picked up. And I think under their totalizing language, almost none of this would actually get read because it is hard to read. You have to be forced to do this. And our suggestion is that students immensely benefit from being forced to reckon with these scenes and think about them, but will default to what is easy and convenient. And here's the thing. Confronting racism is hard. It is unpleasant. It is not enjoyable to pick up a book which will criticize your culture and criticize your society. You must be forced to do so. The effect of a canon is to force you to do something because you believe it is virtuous and important to do so. An inclusive canon full of books that do criticize society, that are Toni Morrison books, are far more likely to get a white person who feels uncertain about the race to pick it up, relate to it, and think about it than is the comfort of the mass market in their world. Even if certain individual teachers feel a compulsion, because there are some great teachers, that select the right books out of a non-canon, those are exactly the teachers in our world who are extremely good at teaching the inclusive literary canon in ways that are well done, in ways that are inclusive, and critically in ways that relate to students. You will not survive as an English teacher if you cannot make Shakespeare relatable to someone. You will not survive a day if you cannot explain why the classics matter, because your students will tune out. You have an interest and an incentive in making sure that the themes of these books make sense, which is why so often teachers display a movie of Shakespeare alongside the book, why so often they tie it into modern poetry and modern culture. These are all things that are possible concurrent with the existence of a canon. Before I go on, open it.
You've proven incentive, but the capacity battle falls against you. In underfunded schools, teachers cannot teach incredibly complex amount of information with the same level of relatability that makes kids actually happy in the same way as
Clearly things are not ideal on both sides. The point of standardization is that when one's a set of 10 books or 15 books that teachers have more often than not themselves read or have read similar books to even if it was in the past. They are far better equipped to be able to, at worst, regurgitate that material back or rely on standardized materials that other teachers have created or that governments have created to do this teaching. But also, because students are more likely to have other friends at other schools or other classes who have also learned that material, they have other people whom they can relate to versus individual discussion. Finally, in under-resourced schools, why on earth are teachers making the right kind of selection? They don't actually mechanize why this is possible, and that's why so much of the first off is ultimately uncomparative. The next thing I want to do is engage with shame, because I think that is a very interesting and very compelling argument from first off, that people feel shamed if they don't conform with high culture. The burden in their argument is to prove that the way that the canon manifests and the way that people explain how the canon matters is to shame you for your mass market preferences. And I don't think this is true for two reasons. First, teachers have an incentive to get their students, and society, publishers have an incentive to get their adult readers to buy into reading the canon, not out of shame because that makes you feel bad, but rather out of the core idea that this is valuable. It is a prerequisite. It's not that you can't read other things, read a trashy rom-com or romance or mass market fiction, but rather that it's incredibly valuable and important that you also understand the canon because it is the prerequisite to the critical thinking skills and understanding of all of literature. And if you haven't read literally every book in the canon, that's not the point. The canon isn't like a checkbox. The idea is that you select certain important, maybe more than just a few, important parts of the canon, relate to them and understand them, and come out better for it because you've gained these critical thinking skills. They have to mechanize why people internalize shame, what is an incentive to make that shame happen. At worst, some people feel worse for themselves. That's not very important. Closing.
If canons act as a benchmark according to you guys, then why is it that most new and upcoming authors are likely to mold their writing styles and their thinking abilities to what is already existing in terms of a benchmark for the market?
I think that the canon is extremely diverse. Like the writing styles of Shakespeare compared to John Steinbeck, compared to what we see in The Great Gatsby, are extremely different in time, in culture, and in place. The canon has room for them because part of the point of a canon is that there's a set of classics that are universal, that apply to describing a large part of the human experience. It ultimately does not matter if there's a divergence of writing styles, but also the writing styles are good, they're interesting, they're engaging, they involve very high-level prose. It is good if authors try to mold that around that instead of what will be immediately popular. The nuance is beneath the surface. It must be understood and related to, but it is immensely valuable to have that feeling of, I finally understand the theme. I get why they made this choice. I understand the narrative devices that are being done. It is a much deeper understanding of literature. And remember, come back to our framing. Most people are not engaging in the selection that they're describing. They are not reading a ton in their everyday life. Women more than men, some people more than others, but the reality is that mass market fiction as an industry compared to every other entertainment industry is more isolated to education than almost any other industry. Not fully, but more. If we are going to need to force people to do something on either side, we'd rather force them to read an extremely valuable but inclusive canon that is far better at selecting than their flawed mechanisms, which ultimately have very little detail from opening up. Very proud to propose.
For a second, I just want my water. I guess we'll wait for Red. Yeah, Red needs to be back, I assume. Oh, are we being recorded? Down. Oh no. Give me my coat. Give me my coat.
So anyways, this leads to nuclear war, yes?
Yes. I need my coat now. God. Okay. Where'd they go? What happened?
Restroom.
Oh, okay. Do amount of caffeine I've drunk, I should probably also go, but like, fine, I'll wait till then around.
Where's your speech?
Yeah. Cool. Is everyone ready? The rest of us, are you good?
Yeah.
Check. Opening government, let's look at the top of DPM's speech. Their mechanism is, universities are liberal. Look at the depth of mechanization they've provided, which is, guys, women can sit in departments at universities. Let me explain why it's actually completely uncomparative and why Oxford English Press dominates the classrooms of the vast majority of the world. There are three very specific things I want to note. One, we would just say that on the comparative, the vast majority of curriculums, things like the IGCSE, things like A-levels, things like O-levels, are dictated by the British. It is a British curriculum that is often set up from top down. The British Council literally dictates the amount of literature that you actively set up. Secondly, it is just untrue that structurally the vast majority of people are women. Sure, this might be the case in McGill, but I would posit the vast majority of places often have old English departments. It is Tolkien that has talked to these types of people. It is the fact that you often have to study Oxford English. It is the fact that you often read Hume and other types of stuff to become an English major on their side of the house, which meant that on the comparative it was just not true that it was primarily women who existed in these places. But thirdly, we would just note that on the comparative, it was very hard to become an English major. Like, guys, a minority wasn't going to become a large-scale academic at the point where it often meant that this was an underfunded and underpaid position. It was a vast majoritarian white society at the point when these academics existed. What this means is two things. One, the vast majority of canon is going to be dictated by white majoritarian views. It is the Oxford English Press that dictates what Pakistan is going to do. It is the fact that your average teacher and other people are often rich white individuals. But secondly, it's very unclear why these aren't often conservative, uncontroversial messages, things like Tolkien versus the comparative or more radical messaging on our side of the house. The first thing then that I want to explain is why teachers are actually much better at picking this kind of curriculum and often making it relatable versus the comparative, dealing with the burden that opening government themselves said, if we prove, we win the debate. There are three things to say here. One, we would note that teachers knew their students particularly well. Often it is just true that when an academic from very far away picks your work, it is quite unrelatable. Yes, these might have deep moral messages. Yes, this might have very profound English within it. The problem is that you often tap out at the very start of class. So I remember none of the 12 books that were taught to me for Shakespeare, because even though my teacher was incredible, it is often the case that people all want to engage in the hard, nuanced language that they talk about. Your teacher could be incredible, but there is a capacity barrier to engaging with a massive cultural shift. The fact that you have to engage with literally reckon 200 years of history at the age of 14 is often massively difficult, which means that it is just the case that even though these books contain messages, they're often just learned and rote memorized. Yes, these messages would be good if they were internalized, but the burden on opening government that isn't proven is that internalization happens. Secondly then, why are teachers able to pick better work on our side of the house? And I'm going to bite the hardline trade-off. Maybe it is true that some of them pick slightly worse work, but this is often relatable work that is often engaging with the average student and often means two very specific things. One, it is more contemporary work. It is work that actively relates to you. So one very good example of this is often people picking regionalized literature. It is the fact that you get to read an author who wrote about your own region. It is things like minority teachers being able to pick black authors from the comparative within our world. It means people can pick regionalized-based literature curriculums to often emphasize and focus on things that their own communities cared about. But secondly, teachers are extraordinarily good at doing this, right? Often little students in the classroom talk about this. Often it is localized authors that exist in the community who you can often pick on our side of the house. That means that comparatively, yes, it might be true that teachers might be slightly worse at picking the absolute best form of literature, but comparatively, at the very least, the kind of literature they pick is something that they themselves deeply understand, that they themselves deeply enjoy, and therefore, they're best equipped to teach this type of literature in the first place. Here's the challenge for all. But guys, what about really bad teachers who pick conservative literature? There are two things I want to note here. One, this scenario probably isn't the most important, because then they would answer a canon, conservative, and literally appropriate way, right? They just pick Hume on the comparative. I don't think that that's a very good thing on either side of the house. But secondly, just note the difference. On their side of the house, they are capped to picking at the best Charles Dickens and trying to teach you the message. Versus on our side, what you pick is Montgomery bus boycotts, things that actively appeal to you, things that are much more regionalized, things that are much more important to the average person. The impact is twofold. One, we get way more engaging literature classics. Like guys, I just think this is particularly important. Even if you're reading Jordan Peterson and can internalize it and can learn about the messages and have a fun discussion in the classroom, I would posit that is a much better form of literary teaching than the comparative where I'm reading Shakespeare and writing 300-page essays. I don't think that that's the kind of literature class that we want. But secondly, this just encourages critical thinking skills. When people engage engaged to our scholarship extent, when they feel they're releasing to the world, I would posit that often means that outside of the house we're able to get this done. Secondly, why do they get less diverse literature on this side of the house within the first place? And I want to be very explicit on the comparative here. Look, opening government at best proves maybe some degree of canon can be inclusive. What they do not prove is how up-and-coming authors are included and who is included in canon. But before that, OJ.
15 seconds. Your intro about old white men at Oxford describing the elements of the status quo, but read the info slide. We are not defending the status quo. An inclusive literary canon refers to one in which works from authors diverge.
Yeah. Anyway, the problem is, you can sure pick diverse works, but these white people are still the ones picking the diverse works, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. What do these kinds of people pick, and why is it it defeats? Firstly, they pick the kinds of authors who are most whitewashed within these communities. They like to pick the kinds of people who are often the good black people, the kinds of people who often engage in like Barack Obama's biography. That is the likely kind of literature for two reasons. One, often these people want to paint these kinds of people as important and want the kind of emphasize. But secondly, obviously they don't want to feel racially guilty, guys. Like obviously the old white man at Oxford is not going to pick I don't know the Rosa Parks' biography when they know that this was something that they didn't support at that point in time. I think it's much likely to be worse kind of literature. But secondly, and before that, closing, do you have your...
When it becomes a norm to take brown authors, it does not matter if they're tokenistic in nature.
Yeah, it does matter, because when you pick the bad kind of brown authors, then obviously you get really bad representations of brown people. Like, I don't know, when you get like active stereotyping of people who actively talk about bad things, I think that's bad. Like, I don't know, you need to prove that. Secondly, okay, why is their culture like less diverse? There are two things I want to note here. One, obviously, on proposition, the kinds of works that are seen as great are Hume and Chaucer. So you often model your writing after them. That's because you want this to be a part of the main canon that you're engaging in. So what you are likely to do is often the new minority artist to get their breakthrough and become part of canon does not want to write new controversial styles. They want to be the same kind of uncontroversial author with deep messaging that opening government want you to talk about. There are two implications of this. One, you preemptively create a chilling effect on writing about controversial, important issues. That means that you don't get the Montgomery bus boycotts in this house. You don't get the inclusive canon because the author wants to make sure that in 20 years you are part of canon. Secondly, and this is super important, we think the comparative is that the way you compete is often on lines. It's on things like minorities who often care about particular niches. So when you want to become a main grandstanding work on an individual level, you often have to cater to a much wider and more popular base, which means that we are likely to get more inclusivity, more types of people on our side of the house. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I thank opening half. Can you please clap them up?
So I think what this debate is sorely lacking is the clear characterization of what each side of the house is going to look like. Because I think the failure of opening government is not telling us clearly how the systems and the standards essentially change in order to be able to have that level of inclusion. That means that at source, you are not able to get a kind of impact because the model that they paint to you is still vaguely similar to the model which has perpetually been exclusive. I think what our model is going to show you, or what our case is going to show you, is how specifically the incentives and the capacity for that change to happen at the top in order for you to get all of the benefits which opening government talks about. But secondly, I think that opening opposition is a bit diluted in terms of how essentially their work, their world is going to look like. I think to a large degree, the impacts they seem to go for is the level of accessibility that comes. I'm not sure why in status quo this does not happen anyway. Most people who get into these kind of books are people who like the kind of language, who essentially like fuck with it, they develop the taste over time. I think that also over time, like if your books are not selling because it has a hard language, you sort of try to dumb it down, create different variations, which essentially makes it accessible. So I think that accessibility impact is not something which is completely exclusive on our side of the house. But first of all, let us talk about how essentially inclusive canonization is characterized on our side of the house. And this has two impacts. I think in response to OO, and it's better than OG, who stick very close to status quo and don't show you how it changes. Why would this be done well? One, I think that by virtue of this motion, there is an imperative or a burden to be inclusive even in the first place. And I think this is what systematically changes from what happens in status quo, where there is no burden on them in order to be exclusive in this way. What then happens? The levels of accountability increases, especially from the audience and mostly from the advocacy groups who are now calling on these groups and saying, you promised this. This is the motive you're going for, and therefore you need to be held accountable to that. Secondly, there's structural change in curriculum and the standards of canonization, and therefore you do not get all of the bad things which opening opposition is talking about. For example, why does it have to be many, many years before we consider it to be a canon? Why, if we see that there's structurally a disadvantage that comes to minority groups as a result of the time, why are we not addressing this, or why are we not changing this? I think there's also capacity to change this, because one, and this is very important, one, the discourse is open, because in status quo, the minorities are excluded from this, and opening opposition is probably right, that the women who exist in there within those groups, or the black people who exist within those groups, are forced to conform and are forced to be silenced because there is no intention that this group necessarily wants to be opened up. I think on that side of the house, minorities listen to, and this is incorporated, and for the first time, that has massive impact. And secondly, the structural problems are then attacked. And thirdly, you have resources which are then dedicated to this mandate, which means that you have institutions, you have government, you have different institutions which are necessarily committed to this and given the resources to be able to adopt that form of change. I think this structurally proves that you get the changes on our side of the house, and therefore you get the impact of more diversity on our side of the house. Before I go on,
I know you're claiming that you're different from OG, but it's very unclear how there's more accountability by minority groups, support groups. Like, what is the mechanism for this? Because if things like colonization were to happen on your side, you would still have the same
but this is so stupid. Like, excuse me, this is so stupid, because immediately you say, we want to be inclusive, we don't want to abolish canons, we want to be inclusive, you are tying yourself to a specific mandate. This is a policy motion. You don't say, oh, well, like, how will this come about? Because, like, once you commit yourself to this, this is a mandate that you are held accountable for, and that is better than status quo, where there is no mandate, or there is no burden, or there's no obligation on you to be inclusive to that extent. Secondly, what's the characterization of the counterfactual? I think, like the COPOI says, the taste still exists. People's who desire for this. It's unclear why people's preferences immediately shift to stuff in TikTok and like the dumb shit which they continually show over there. Which means that the only way to change this behavior is to change it at source. We say that if these industries or these boards have been able to establish the taste preferences on these people, it's imperative that it is their power which is able to break these standards. But if you don't believe that, secondly, this is still not decided by the public. And I know OG's response is that, well, the public is majority. I think this is very thinly veiled. And there are a couple of things to this. One, this is still subject to marketing, which means that it is the big corporations who are able to put this in front of you. That's how you even be able to see it in the first place. Secondly, it is the publisher's preferences, which even decides what comes to market even in the first place, which means that minority actors are then excluded, and you don't even get that kind of assessment in the first place for them to even be looked at. Which means that thirdly, there's a shut-off of the minority discourse at source, because minorities feel we don't belong to this space. I never read those fucking books because I didn't know how it impacted me. So if you say, now it's open, I should talk about it on TikTok, I have no opinion because I've never been structurally included within this space. The third one, and this is very, very important, if immediately you decide to eliminate this, you've not eliminated the benefits which they've gotten over time as a result of the classification, or as a result of the classist system which still exists. Which means you'll still be competing with rich authors who have essentially got all of the wealth from the books which they've sold. Their students and the established styles, which is still a preference for those people. Established producers and publishers who have the resources and have no incentive to shift, even in the first place. We provide that incentive because it is something that comes from the top, and we think that that then structurally changes how the game is played.
Your PM says the reason the inclusive art is done well is to avoid backlash, meaning we are in a liberal society. So our argument is you have elite black artists with complex language on your side because the academics make it.
No, like,
publishers wanted to be
I'll be
simple language
addressing
access
that
our claims to the
like elite language thing very, very soon. But I think like they won't work if you just try to undermine our case and just say, oh, these guys said backlash. The reasons I gave to you is far more stronger than that in terms of the imperative which necessarily goes to them. Because by virtue of the motion, we have to do that. By virtue of the motion, they have to put it on themselves and do it. You don't just say, oh, well, there's already been backlash. I think it is when that mandate exists. For example, how did Martin Luther King, how was he able to advocate for the rights of civil groups? Is by the establishment in the first place that there is an importance for blacks to be able to exist within their own state and be unharmed. Without that concession within government, every kind of backlash that you do is different, and that's where I think it is super impactful for us. The best response that you get to our case comes from opening opposition. Two things they say. First of all, that there's whitewash minority. I think on the comparative, if you have Obamas, that's probably better than their world, where these black people are not even seen in the first place, or this minority is not even seen in the first place. But then I think that it will be very dumb for them to do so, especially if the aim is to go for diversity and all of the market incentives does exist, which means that if it's still approximate to these people, it is still unlikely to sell that message. Because realize that on that side of the house, the only message they have to sell is that this is inclusive. And without making it inclusive, I'm not sure how essentially do that. What they also say is that, well, you won't get the best canon, but I've already shown you how the standards essentially change in our world in a way to make it very, very inclusive, and therefore you are able to get all of the impacts which we talk about on our side of the house. I think we win this today. Thanks.
This is good. Around the 6-minute 15th mark, I think DLO gets to the heart of what the opening opposition, of what the opposition case rather, should actually be about. Because this is a debate, and this is something that I try to get from OG as well, just to get a sense of what this should be about. Because I think there's a lot of back and forth on all ends in terms of like high culture or literary canon right now not being representative. OG and CG want to make it more representative. OG says this is from the start of time, so this is just the world that we would prefer overall. So I first want to characterize what this world would look like. I think this world, probably from the start of time in OG's language, looks like publishing houses, massively advertising, that this is your chance if you're a minority to be part of the high culture. For example, in media, the way this is pushed is that this is a chance for you to gain actively more status, that this is the kind of work that you should be producing, this is the kind of writing style that you should be following, these are the kind of models and the kinds of stories that you should be focusing on. And yes, OG is right, this is from the start of time, but just because it's the start of time doesn't mean that, for example, there are no racial, ethnic, or income divisions in society. Like, obviously, there are going to be people who are poorer. There are obviously people who, for example, go to public schools versus people who go to Eton and therefore are much better kind of prepared and established to do things like write literary canon and write the kind of high culture that you want to talk about to begin with. So the extension from closing opposition is going to be about up-and-coming authors. And this is something that Muzi kind of gets at in the last minute of his speech, where he says that now all you do is try to force your work into a literary, like a work that fits the literary canon, and don't talk about issues that are much more important. There's less contemporary work, there's less discourse created. So what Muzi does a good job is of weighing that when they say there are two implications, and there's less discourse, there's less relevant issues being talked about. But they never really explain why just because there's an effort for more inclusivity in literary canon, does that mean that, for example, the vast majority of minority artists are going to be forced to change their writing styles and forced to join this literary canon? And that's the first burden that I'm going to prove in this debate. So why are they likely to do so? The first thing is that they're likely to fall prey to the narrative of publishing houses. I think these publishing houses have significant control over, for example, the kinds of things that artists are likely to do, which is the case that they can submit things like reports, run massive media campaigns, because this is literally what OG wants. Like, if you want the OG and CG model to work, this is literally what you would need to do to convince a lot of minority artists to join the literary canon and join the high culture to begin with. These publishing houses are popular locally, and as a result, them being part of high society is quite appealing to the people who are currently not. But the second thing, and this is really, really important, is that people who, for example, are racial minorities, ethnic minorities, or income minorities, actively crave prestige for their lives, their parents, their grandparents' life, and intergenerationally. They've been labeled as second-class citizens, and now they finally have the opportunity to be in the same footing. They're not the house help, but now works from their community are going to be read by the richest of the rich. This is really, really important, because these are individuals who crave high status, no thank you. And for example, if for example you make it to the highest culture, you for example rub shoulders and get invited to socialization parties that for example are full of rich people, this is something that you're likely to crave. This prestige is what gets to you, and this is really, really important, because this is the missing burden that O does not fill. We weekly prove why the vast majority of artists who are currently marginalized are now, from the start of time in OG's language, going to be forced into this. Why is this really bad? O does the weighing for you, which is that this just reduces discourse overall. You are likely to tone down your language. You, for example, write fiction about kings, and you get the morals that OG wants, which is like honesty, brotherhood, etc. But you don't talk about issues that are relevant to you. You don't write, for example, biographies, for example, how you made it from poverty, something that's significantly more relatable to your community. So this is the way that you access the opening opposition impacts. Because note, this is not a policy motion. This is a this house prefers motion. So we need to show in terms of how this is likely to play out, which I don't think any of the teams really, really do. But all of this was assuming that you're successful to begin with, that you make it to the top, and that you are the select few who make it to high culture and are part of literary canon. The vast majority of people are not going to do so, and minority artists waste their life and waste their talent on their side of the house. Why is that the case? Two reasons. One, because if you look at the info site, it just says diversity. Diversity is a very big umbrella. It, for example, encompasses all races. It encompasses different income classes, different ethnicities, different genders. Very, very few. The top 0.01% of the people who now want to be part of literary canon actually make it to the schools that OG wants them to make it to. This is really, really important, because a lot of individuals are fucked in the process of trying to climb up the ladder. I'll take you up to this point. And as a result, I just think a lot of them fail. But secondly, I want to talk about diverse experiences and what they actually mean. Because opening opposition is like, the Oxford English press dominates this, but I think that falls straight to the OG and CG attacks, which is like, there is some kind of liberalization, local state education departments, etc. are the ones who are deciding this. No thank you. Why is this really, really important? Even if you buy and agree to everything that came from CG extension, this is still bad, because as a result, the top 0.01% of the people are likely to be, for example, people who in the history have went abroad, who, for example, studied in the Oxfords and Cambridges, who have actively been influenced by colonial thought. So even if you have diversity in race, you don't have diversity in thought and experience, because these are the very, very privileged. So I don't think they access any of the impacts OG.
On your side of the house, teachers are likely to default to the most popular books, the books that are pushed the hardest by publishing houses, and the ones that are most generic either way. How are you supposed to get a variety of voices when the canon is controlled so much by the majoritarian view?
I'll get to that in the comparative before that.
So in status quo, minority cannot compete with the majority. Give me any reason why they would still like to dumb down their work and replicate it to the majority when they can't compete.
Same POI, here's the comparative. I want to focus on two things. Before that, I just want to quickly get done with the implication of this. Top 0.01% make it, you waste the careers of many minority artists who want to be part of this high culture but are not able to be part of this high culture. Now, why is the comparative better, and why do we actually reach a lot of people, and why do we make these minority artists reach people? The first is that you play to that comparative advantage. That comparative advantage is talking about lived experiences, or experiences that have been not talked about by the Shakespeares of the world, where they write about monarchies, or they write about like marriage failures and cheating and whatever, and frame it in a very elitist language. Some experiences are unrepresented, and people are likely to cater, for example, to things they haven't read before, to, for example, experiences and backgrounds that they haven't been exposed to. And this is uniquely how we tap into, for example, language that is not just more accessible but also different, which is really important. So we tap into that comparative advantage. But secondly, I think that on their side, the comparative is significantly worse, because You are just from a public school who wants to be part of this high culture, but you're competing, as I said, against the people who went to Eton, who have been trained to write in a specific language, in a specific way, so you'll never make it to the top. That's why, for example, you always be structurally disadvantaged. On our side of the house, you have the choice to maximize your preferences and create a niche of your own, so you're much more likely to be successful. And this is really important because there is a trade-off. There's only so much time you can spend as an artist, there's only so much media and publicity that can surround all of your work. So the comparative is one when you carve out a niche, and that only happens when you talk about what you really want to talk about, when you talk about your experiences, and that's what you get from CO.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I now invite the government whip.
At the top of my speech, I want to clear out a really messy complaint, which is that we don't have feasibility. That's just absurd, right? Because firstly, that's not a part of this debate inside this house prefers. Secondly, we still give you structural reasons why we have more feasibility, right? It's things like, firstly, it looks at more funding into research about more minority literature. It looks like the syllabus changing to adapt to minority literature changing as well. Why is this likely to be the case? It's extremely intuitive, right? Think about Cambridge. The fact that the degree you get from the CIE is so valuable is simply because of the fact that it's an adaptable system. It's a system that adapts to the status quo, and universities want more systems that adapt to the status quo because they want students who can fucking contribute to the status quo in the first place, right? Other than that, they have no reason to give scholarships to children in the first place. This is exactly why every 2 to 3 years, the fucking CIE literally changes its syllabus and updates it over and over again, right? But secondly, then the entire degree has no value from school in the first place, right? If this is a degree that's so chauvinistic in nature and has no value and is literally stereotypes about black people and brown people, I don't understand why parents would want their children to subscribe to that form of education in the first place. It takes lakhs and lakhs for you to fund your child's education under these boards. It's extremely expensive. They need to prove to you why incentive to fund education that's so backwards exists in the first place, right? Secondly then, in terms of this extremely absurd claim that comes out of OO, which is that now we pick the most stereotyped creations of minorities. A few responses to this, right? First is, researchers do research to progress society. That's literally what they get their accolades on the basis of. That's what they get their fucking Nobel Prizes or whatever they get on the basis of in the first place. I need reasons as to why researchers would inherently choose books which are so backwards in nature. It makes no sense to me, right? But thirdly, and extremely importantly, I asked them in a POI, it does not matter if minorities are tokenized and their works are stereotyped, as long as they're a part of the curriculum itself, we're fine with it. The response they give to us is very diminishing. They just say, it's stereotyped, guys. Firstly, no reasons as to why it's stereotyped. My partner told you why it's extremely crucial to include minorities into a system of canonization, and that's not something they respond to. Their case is extremely unresponsive, right? I'll then move on to CO, who I think has the better claim in this debate, right? Which is more relevant, right? What do they tell us? Their biggest push is that firstly, minorities will now have to adapt, guys. Second response is, their lived experiences aren't heard anymore. The second response is the basis of the first response, right? Note, why do minorities write books about the lived experiences if those books don't get bought under either worlds, right? If there's an established ideology, that established ideology against minorities exists in both worlds. If a niche minority book isn't picked up on our world, it's not picked up under their world, which means these niche minority media houses or books will get published under either worlds because they don't give a shit about money, they just want to put their experiences forward. Second thing is, minorities will have to adapt, guys. Here's where my partner's extension is extremely crucial, and this is where I deal with the idea about accountability as well. I have 3 responses to this. having different writing styles which are unique in nature. But secondly, in our worst case, they don't do it yet. The thing is, they have the foot on the table at least, which is to say, when you in the media world have to fight to put a case of a minority forward, to put a book of a minority forward, you have some degree of justification by saying, guys, their work, a work by a brown Indian author, was canonized in the past. They have some degree of prestige, they have some degree of credibility. This is the credibility that's extremely crucial for minorities, which puts their foot forward into academia or into literature in the first place. The conclusion of this is that it becomes a self-fulfilling or a self-correcting mechanism. Sure, right now, minorities don't have the political capital to have unique styles in our worst case. In the future, when they have more prestige and more credibility, they have the ability to change the writing style and to create a more unique writing style, because the writing style isn't seen as dumb or unorthodox. It's something that was born out of a community that's a high prestige. This is exactly what changed the Roman and the Greek literature in the first place. It started with Homer, it became more diverse in the future because these people are seen as inherently more reputable, inherently more intelligent in the first place. That's the delta that OG misses, which we give you. What does OG tell you? And here's why we're different from OG. Before short opening.
We explain how the local black teacher in a minority school picks out relatable to them. This also makes everything CO implicates, right? And it itself prefers motion, it's not backward looking. It also means that the average person sees old minority artists being pushed upon them. And that is also the analysis that kills you.
Wait, what? If this ideology exists in both worlds, if colonization happened in both worlds and we don't prioritize minority literature, and if they claim that it's tokenistic whatever literature comes out, I'm not sure what the delta of that fucking PI is. Closing.
Your response to our extension that in the long term you have more diversity does not stand, because as I said, there might be diversity in race, but it's like the richest black person who makes it to the top. There's no diversity in thought.
Here's what's absurd. For that to work, they need to prove why minority literature gets more access or more exposure under their model. Since they haven't done that, I don't understand if you have 10 different unique minority novels, but none of them get picked up or get picked up significantly less than white novels, why the fuck it matters that you have more uniqueness? I told you, my partner told you exclusively that when you have more prestige, the unique novels firstly get created later, but even if they do, they get picked up significantly more because minorities have a greater degree of prestige as a result of them being a part of that canon. That's why canonization is extremely important, because in either worlds, racial hierarchy will exist, religious hierarchy will exist. It's under which world do minorities have some degree of credibility about the literature, about the lived experiences that they so cry about giving exposure to. They need to prove to you in the fucking whip speech why whatever literature that you have of a minority with a very niche experience gets even some degree of credibility or gets picked up by some book model which does not make enough money to begin with. They need to be very comparative, because this has been extremely uncomparative so far. Moving on then, right? What else do we get from them? They say, and this is also absurd, they say that, guys, literature is so sophisticated right now, I as a 14-year-old just don't get it. I don't understand why we would put that literature down people's throats in the first place. If these are children who can't read highly sophisticated literature at all, it's unlikely that we would let them read colored, whatever very fancy literature we read in university to children in the first place. Firstly, it's very likely that this is going to be put in a way that doesn't push the children's throat. It's going to be comprehensible in nature, right? As a result, this is something that OO's entire claim places, the entire impact system bases on. Given that this is simply untrue, because first, we're the only team that gives you structural incentives of the education board itself to not push this literature down the throat. We clearly take it over OO. We take it over OG because we're the only team that takes you at the spirit of this debate. And we take it over CG because we give you very comparative analysis as to why our literature of minorities is the one that gets more exposure.
Speaker Leslie, to conclude the debate, I invite the answer.
I think Shakespeare is pretty cool, I won't lie. It's pretty cool, but I also think that local authors like Esquipchukari are also very cool. I think Mark Twain is also very good, but I also think that people like Salvatore Sandmanto are good. Why is this important? The reason this is important is because I think there are people in this room who belong to different backgrounds who can name authors of their own localities and regions that they think are probably just as good as all these cool people that we have all grown up studying like Shakespeare and Roald Dahl. But these people never see the light of day. I won't know some good author from India, he might not know a good author from Pakistan. And that is specifically the issue with any type of canon, no matter how inclusive it can be. That is, even if government bench can allow you to have as inclusive of a canon as possible, the establishment of the benchmark that they want to create is structurally and inherently exclusionary, and that is why our extension will win this debate. So the first thing I want to do then is, why is the establishment of the canon on government bench inherently exclusionary? And I will make this argument by taking them at their best, which is like, I'll agree to OG that this is the beginning of time, support groups exist, mandates exist, accountability, all the stuff that you get from government bench. There are 3 reasons for why any canon on their side will always be exclusionary. The first is, even if this is the beginning of time, certain conditions will never change. i.e. things like the process of colonization will always take place, and you will always have people who belong to the Western world who will have colonized countries, and their sort of curriculum will be thrown onto them, onto the colony, right? So essentially they will always have a first mover's advantage in making that sort of canon. But secondly, what Costa tells you, and very importantly so, that is for up-and-coming authors to actually make it into the canon, or even be remotely relevant, they need to write in ways, or they need to pander to certain thoughts and ideas that are already established. So what that means is taking the prose and taking the vocabulary, using punctuation that has been used in similar ways, because you know that will work. But it's not just because they want to do it, it's also because their training has been done in a way where they're only meant or able to write in that particular way, right? So that's the second reason. But thirdly, and this is something Costa also mentions, about publishing houses, how they are risk-averse and they don't want to take a chance with some author, be it minority, not minority, they don't want to take a chance with somebody they don't know whose work will work. What is the impact of this? The impact of this is that even if they can give you some credible mechanisms, that there is some eventual convergence to inclusivity, they are unlikely and will always fall short, which means the most vulnerable will always be left out. They do, however, give 2 points over here to mitigate our responses. The first thing that they say is that no, diversity is coming about, and I think makes this they're kind of not genuine to the OG case, which is OG tries to allude to the idea that there is some mechanisms that universities and academia are more diverse. But the problem with this is not that just the stuff that you get from they're all white. The idea is that most people in academia who are going to be doing the discussions on their side are tenured professors, right? The idea that to get tenure, you need to be in a place and a position in society to actually acquire it, which means it is highly unlikely that you will have the sort of diversity that they claim to be existing in tenured spaces where this discussion is going to be taking place. No, thank you. But secondly, as far as their majoritarian tendency argument goes, that on our side, the only books you pick are going to be majoritarian dominant, is also comparatively better off than their side. Which is to say, even if on our side you're locally choosing more majoritarian preferential sort of books or whatnot, the idea is on their side of the house, canon globally for almost every country will always be Western dominated. Notice why on the comparative our world is better. Even if on our side of the house, even if a minority person from Pakistan can't put a fucking book out, the local author in Pakistan who does have some sort of clout, they are able to rise in their own fucking country, right? So on their side of the house, to be clear, the canon that you have established is usually global and is one that is Western dominated to begin with. On our side, even if a minority person in Pakistan or any other country for that matter can't put their work out, people from that region who already do have good works, they come up on top as well. Notice why this is important then. This is important because if both sides agree that there are some mechanisms to eventually converge to inclusivity, our world is faster, because for them to get the inclusivity that we would like for different ethnicities across the world to show up in the canons, their world takes far longer because it requires them to change the version of the canon from Western to include other countries, and then from that they have to include people within those regions. On our side, we sidestep that. We already have people within those countries showing up, and we allow minorities from those nations to join in as well later on. Before that, sure.
Canons in Canada and China are clearly different, but even so, why are you okay with dismissing all contemporary prestigious black authors like Zadie Smith and Ta-Nehisi Coates as whitewashed and part of the dominant force, where you have no mechanism for how you're going to pick good works on your side of the house?
So the first problem with the first half of this view, I was this was just asserted that canons are different. I'll assert back that they're not. But more importantly and crucially, if your claim is that how will minorities on our side come out, first of all, I've already shown you that. But I do want to be clear, the sort of minorities that you get on your side of the house who are showing up are the people who are molding their styles to fit majoritarian tendencies. Note, they said CG that, this is better than no representation. But like, holy shit, that's such a debate land argument to make. This is like saying I would much rather choose a poisonous glass of milk versus an empty glass of milk. The problem with having people who are literally molding their styles to fit majoritarian tendencies is the fact that you are able to stereotype an existing and already vulnerable group. So they don't get that on their side of the house. What then is the way up? Take it a bit. What then is the way up? On our side, we might lose on this benchmark that government bench likes, but what we get is more diversity on a regional level, which if you aggregate on a global level is far better for these artists. But secondly, what we allow then is for our artists to actually do and write what they like to actually put forward. Sure.
Free markets of ideas means that Western literature can invade Pakistan and override it with the incentives and influence which you mentioned. On our side, Pakistani literature is canonized and therefore respected and protected.
No, but the problem with this is like, we think that canons anywhere are never good, because when you have a canon, you create a barrier which makes it harder for younger artists or newcoming artists to actually enter the market. That's the whole point of the extension, right? But more specifically then, like, I want to deal with like the stuff you get from teachers on their side. First of all, if your issue is this, like, you know, teachers are bad and they're going to tell what they like, I think the issue over here is that most canon, by virtue of being so Western dominated, already isn't relatable. Not for the reason that O gives you that they can't relate to those experiences and they're old. It's because it's fucking colonial, right? You already have anti-colonial sentiment within you when you're reading this literature. It's hard for you to internalize or relate to that literature to begin with, right? So on their side, it's very unclear to me like why kids will actually incur in those thought experiments when this is literature that they've been grown up to believe is from the bad colonizer, right? But lastly then, on the idea of like whitewashed minorities, we have given you reasons to believe why on our side, minorities from local and regional levels are likely to show up faster than they will ever show up on their side of the house. For those reasons, closing opposition wins this debate.